Good morning. My name is Sarah Emmons, and as a member of Southwold Council and the Southwold War Veterans Memorial Committee, I'd like to welcome you today back to an in-person Southwold Remembrance Day service. We welcome our distinguished guests and from various levels of government and community leadership as we honor Southwold and Canadian veterans of past conflicts. Our gathering is especially poignant this year, as once again the world has experienced the aggressions of a despot seeking dominance over neighboring European nations. The Canadian Harvard Aircraft Association will do a flyover traveling through Southwold over Fingal, Shedden, and Talbotville between 10:50 a.m. and 11:10 a.m. We are also anticipating an air tribute by the Canadian Owners and Pilots Flight 75 Association between 11:15 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. Now, please welcome Reverend John Brown for a remembrance of some very special people.
Good morning. Over the past several years, our population of Southwold veterans and associates of the Southwold War Veterans Memorial Service has dwindled. Traditionally, we attempt to remember some of these treasured members of the Southwold community who have passed since last we gathered for Southwold's Remembrance Day service. Randall Douglas Randy Graham passed peacefully on March 11th, 2022. Born and raised in Fingal, he lived his life in Elgin County. Randy and his wife Bonnie were part of the Boxall Women's Institute group that organized and served refreshments following many of our Remembrance Day programs. As a young man, Spider participated on Fingal softball teams. More recently, he traded his baseball hat for a ukulele as a member of the Southwold Young at Heart group. James David Jim Carmichael passed away on Tuesday, September the 6th, 2022. Jim graced our Remembrance Day service for several years as the bagpiper who led the parade of veterans and performed as an integral member of the Moment of Silence tributes. A sincere and honorable man, Jim Carmichael is remembered by this assembly for his dignity and his music. Although never in actual attendance at Southwold Remembrance Day services, there is no denying that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II was nevertheless a powerful presence. Most of the seniors in this room, and certainly all of the veterans who preceded our generation, started their elementary day school with God Save the King or Queen. We have incorporated that tradition by including the tribute to our monarch for our memorial service. Princess Elizabeth served in the British Army as a teenager. At age 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, where she learned car mechanics and truck driving. Her courage and dedication to the war efforts was a great inspiration to the Commonwealth. No doubt, Southwold's active service volunteers during World War II were buoyed by her example. We mourn the passing of Queen Elizabeth II on September 8, 2022, as one of our own. Sarah, if you wish to come forward. Each year we honor the 546 Southwold veterans listed on the plaque inside the front doors of the Keystone complex. It is difficult to definitively verify, but it is the best considered opinion of the Southwold Veterans Committee that at the age of 99 years, Francis Newland was quite possibly the last Southwold veteran of the 20th century to pass on. This is our tribute to the last of our 20th century Southwold veterans, and the video is going to be shown.
Born December 6, 1923, Francis Lee Newland never had to look for a playmate. A twin brother, Charles, was always nearby to share the joys of growing up on the family farm. The Newland family resided on their farm located on the north side of what is now Fingal Line, just before the east entrance to the Southwold Township village of Fingal, Ontario. It is currently home to the Burgess family and has been for many decades. Francis' parents, Russell and Florence Berger Newland, grew cash crops and raised dairy cattle. It was good to have extra helping hands. When they were old enough for elementary school, Francis and Charles didn't have far to travel. SS number 12, Fingal School, was only steps away from the Newland farm. When this class photo was taken on May 3, 1934, a number of the Fingal boys had no idea that current events in Europe would change their lives in a few short years. In 1939, World War II broke out in Europe. As they became of age, 5 of the boys in the class, Harold Knott, Albert Haggerty, Ed Jones, Fred Jones, and Francis Newland, enlisted in the Canadian military and joined the fight. On January 8, 1943, Francis and his close friend and neighbor, Noel Lidster, joined the Canadian Army. They signed on in London, Ontario, took basic training in Listowel, and moved on to Petawawa for advanced training. In the summer of 1943, Francis boarded the passenger liner Queen Elizabeth, refitted as a troop carrier, and sailed for England. In England, Francis took further training in ballistics and artillery weapons. He was assigned to the 2nd Canadian Medium Regiment, part of the 1st Canadian Corps that saw action in Italy from Sicily to Ortona to Monte Cassino, Ravenna, and Rimini. Francis always felt that the regiment's efforts in Italy played a large role in the decimation of German troops who would otherwise have moved on to oppose Allied forces in France and Belgium. Francis also served in France and Holland, including disarming enemy troops at the end of the war in Europe. During his time in Europe, Francis wrote a letter to his cousin, Jack Berger of Fingal. Francis noted that while on a much-anticipated leave, he visited Rome for a few days. A friendly visit this time. While at St. Peter's Cathedral, he had a few words with the Pope. Not many farm boys from Fingal could make that claim. Francis served until the end of the war and was discharged in 1946. Unlike his Fingal school chum Harold Knott, who was killed September 28, 1944, Francis was a survivor of the war. He had a future to enjoy and a full life ahead. Francis made the most of his opportunity. Following the war, Francis moved to Alberta to work for a company in the Peace River area. clearing land to make homesteads for war veterans. In 1947, he met Mary Margaret Verbonek, who was born and raised on a Saskatchewan farm near the small town of Leask. The couple was married in Vancouver on April 21, 1948, and settled in the Eaglesham, Alberta area. The Newlands welcomed their first child, Arnold, in April 1949. In 1950, they moved to their own farm homestead on a piece of land Frances had helped clear. The young family endured many hardships over the next 7 years on their Alberta farm. However, there were also many good times. Over that period, they added Robert, Linda, Sherry, and Ronald to the Alberta branch of the Newland clan. The family moved back to Ontario in 1957, and son Larry was born in 1960. Sadly, the Newlands would mourn the loss of Linda in 1971 from a very lengthy and rare medical ailment. For many years, Frances farmed his own small farm on Bostwick Road, north of St. Thomas. It was a lifestyle he enjoyed for a lifetime. Frances' love of gardening would be a constant for the remainder of his life. In June 1960, he certified as a registered nursing assistant at the St. Thomas Psychiatric Hospital. He continued to work at the hospital until his retirement in 1975. He went back to farming with neighbors John and Richard Andrews until 1998, then retired for good and moved into St. Thomas. Upon retirement, Frances and Mary enjoyed traveling and embraced their golden years. He loved his family unconditionally and relished any opportunity for family celebrations and special events. The Newland family expanded over the years as his children married and had their own families. Frances and Mary were blessed with 9 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. Frances and Mary enjoyed a loving life together for almost 74 years. Frances was proud of his wartime service and was a member of Lord Elgin Branch No. 41, Royal Canadian Legion in St. Thomas. In addition to the memories, both pleasant and painful, he carried with him from his World War II experiences, Frances also suffered partial hearing loss from the explosions of battle, but he was a survivor and led a productive life. Frances Newland passed away at the St. Thomas Elgin General Hospital on Thursday, February 10, 2022, in his 99th year. Of the 546 men and women from Southwold who served Canada in the great wars of the 20th century, Frances Lee Newland from Fingal is the last warrior. We salute a life well lived.
In 2020 and 2021, we found the technical resources to continue bringing one of the defining elements of our Southwold Remembrance service via virtual presentation. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Southwold's favorite author, historian, and broadcaster back once again to the Keystone complex. There is no doubt that Ted's light shines especially bright in front of a live audience. The stories are just as compelling, but our audience needs to be in the room. To detail his new book, Battle of the Atlantic, please welcome Ted Barris.
Good morning, everybody. And everybody's being so patient, and that's wonderful. It's important. I'm going to try to talk through the audio that you won't be able to hear from my presentation. This is going to be a real challenge, but we'll manage. I'm also told that I can't get out of the light. If I go over here, I'm out of the light. If I go over there, what they need is they need one of those dog fences that goes zzz, zzz, stops me from going. Okay. As many of you know, and first let me say, it's fabulous to be back with people. Yes! And some of my favorite people. It's really a delight. Most of you know, you guys don't because you're new here, I've written books that kind of, when they spotlight military history, it's kind of a sliver of history. Juno was about D-Day, June 6, 1944. Vimy was about the 4 days in April 1917, the famous battle in the First World War. Dam Busters, May the 16th, 1943. This book is about the longest battle of the Second World War, the longest continuous military action. Anybody know how many days there were in the Second World War? I'll give you a hint, 2,074. Okay? Right? Remember that number, 2,070. So how do you put 2,074 days between the covers of one book? You can't. However, as most of you know, there's a key to getting the stories of this important battle out, and I'll show you how the technique. The legacy of the battle is essentially cold, hard data, facts, artifacts, such as that building on the right-hand side, or the left-hand side. That's the Naval Museum in Halifax. And it's actually the place where it was known as Admiralty House in Halifax. And Admiralty House was the branch office of the Royal Navy in Canada. Every time a convoy left Halifax or North Sydney, in that building, the Commodore would tell the skippers, the captains, and the crews of the merchant ships that were leaving North America and going to Britain and back, what path they would take, how fast they would go, how they would dodge around the U-boats. But he often didn't give that last detail to them, the likelihood that a quarter or a third of them, as many as 20 or 30 ships, might not get there. But it was all done in that room. But there's nobody there now. It's just a great old, beautiful building. And the one on the right is the Calgary Naval Museum. I was there yesterday afternoon. And again, they got these bold, fabulous artifacts that show you the strength and the power of the Royal Canadian Navy, but there's nobody there to tell you the stories. So the point is that the legacy is kind of inanimate. These are coming close. These are the two remaining ships that served in the Royal Canadian Navy that are around today. HMCS Sackville was a corvette on the left in Halifax, and on the right, the Tribal-class destroyer Haida in Hamilton. They're there, but they're floating museums, and unless you can get somebody who served in them to walk you through and give you a sense of how it all went, you're going to have to find your own way. And then there are movies. You can't hear the audio on this, but this is from a movie called Greyhound. Anybody see it? Some of you have. And it featured Tom Hanks as a commander of an American ship leading a convoy across the North Atlantic, fighting off the U-boats. A lot of Canadians say, well, that can't be because the Americans weren't there. Well, yes, they were. So it's fair. And this is really action-packed. You can see some of the images, and the sound is thundering. We might play it later. But the point is, you know how this movie was made? Have you ever heard the term green screen? Yeah? What's green screen? Somebody put her hand up. Yes, what is it? It's light green, yes, but what does it symbolize? What's going on with a green screen? Yes? You can get an app, yeah. It'll change the scene. You know what it is? It's called digital animation, which means that all of that ocean action and the action of the battle between the U-boats and the corvettes and the destroyers and the merchant sailors in this movie is all manufactured in a post-production studio, right? Now, it was done in the United States. It was done by Apple Plus TV or whatever the heck it was, and you can see it online with your app. You're absolutely right. But unless you know what you're doing, and the Americans sometimes don't when they're reporting history, you got to get somebody who knows what to do. Now, some of you have already purchased my book. You'll notice a name on the very bottom of the front cover. The man that's named on the cover, his name is Gordon Laco. He was the naval advisor on Greyhound. He made sure that all of the navigational tables looked right, that the orders from the commander to the crew was correct, that the action looked the way it was supposed to look. Do you know where Gordon's from? Midland, Ontario. The Americans have to come to Canada to get the history right. Right? And I asked Gordon, I said, I've just finished my manuscript, Gordon, and you're an expert. I'm going to hire you to read my book before it goes to press and find all the mistakes so we can fix them. So he did that. So there shouldn't be any mistakes in there. I hope. Anyway, but the point is, this is inanimate too. The reality is that the Battle of the Atlantic is about people. And my strength, if I have it, is to get to the people to help give the story of the battle a face. So I'm going to tell you about some of the people, share some of the experiences they went through. This man I met in Burlington about 35 years ago. His name is Desmond Pierce. He was a regular Navy force guy all the way through the war. Actually, he started by joining the Royal Military College in the 1930s. And when he graduated from Kingston, he went to the Royal Canadian Navy looking for a job. They didn't have many ships around, so they told him, go overseas to the Royal Navy, become a cadet in the Royal Navy in England, and earn 25 cents a day for 5 years, which is what he did, right? And then when he graduates from that, he comes back and is posted to HMCS Restigouche, one of our first destroyers, which, by the way, was on loan from Great Britain to us to bolster our Navy. Anybody know how many Royal Canadian Naval ships there were at the beginning of the war in 1939? I'll save you the trouble. 13. We had 13 ships on the 3rd of September 1939. And by the end of the war, 6 years later, we had 400 fighting ships. So how do we get from 0 to 100 miles an hour in 6 years? Well, I'm going to tell you some of that. And it's the people, some of them including Debbie Pierce, who illustrates. Now, in 1940, he, aboard Restigouche, gets the call to quickly get overseas and get to France. Why? Because we're pulling out. It's Dunkirk. We're retreating. We're getting men off the shore of France back to England to regroup ourselves. And he gets the call to go to Saint-Valery-en-Caux. And so Restigouche goes overseas to join the retreat, pulling Scottish troops. He's describing it here. You can't hear it. But he talks about the fact that he was told by his skipper, the commander of Restigouche, find an officer and see if you can get somebody to get some information. So he goes down to his office below. He's a sub-lieutenant. And he salutes himself. He's going to do it now. He just did it. And here he is. And he said, I'm going to get a bag, and I'm going to put an Aldous lamp and a pair of binoculars and a cask of whiskey in this and go off and pull some of the soldiers that I'm supposed to get off the shore from Saint-Valery-en-Caux. And so he gets the job to go out there in a small lifeboat and start to bring these guys out. Okay? But what was really interesting is that as he was bringing them back to his ship, he said the two destroyers, Restigouche and Saint-Laurent, come charging in past him, storming the Germans who are trying to kill the Scottish troops who are leaving and try to blow him out of the water. So he suddenly realizes that his ship is defending him as he's bringing these first of these Scottish troops back to his ship. And he said he witnessed the very first shots in anger by the Royal Canadian Navy. But one of the things that happens when you're doing history, what's the very big part of a battle? When I talk about battles, what does that mean, ladies? What is a battle? It's a battle between two enemies, right? There's lots of action. There's lots of hatred. There's lots of death. There's lots of loss. Well, as a historian, you get sucked into that, seduced by that, because that's what people want to read about in a war book. But I suddenly, after about 6 months of writing this book, realized that I was maybe missing the forest for the trees. I got a letter from a friend who gave me a letter that this woman had written. It was her aunt, Alex Masheter. She was born in Haliburton, Ontario. She immigrated to Britain in the 1930s, marries just in 1939, has a child just about the time the war begins. And the letter that was sent to me by the friend, written by Alex, was written on this date. Why is that significant? It's the very first day of the war. And suddenly I recognized this letter would help me put into perspective what the Battle of the Atlantic was about. Yes, it's about combat. It's about that incredible gauntlet between North America and Britain that the merchant ships and the escorts made. But what was the point of it? The point of it was to keep England alive. And this made me understand that. She writes about the blackouts on the very first day of the war. The lights go out, the curtains go up to black out all the light. And then she talks about her husband, who was an air raid warden as well as working in the rubber industry, and they talk about rationing. The realities that Britons face in the early days of the war is that everything is going to be minimized, it's going to be lost, all the essentials, coal, gas, and electricity, fuel, and so on, but also vital things like tea and sugar. And she talks about that, and that's when I realized this battle is important not just for its strategy and tactics and victory and defeat, it's also about keeping England alive, so that otherwise Churchill would have been running the war from Ottawa, because they would have been booted out of England or invaded, and he'd have done it here. Okay? So it's keeping the military and the civilians, about 40 million Britons, alive. That's what the Battle of the Atlantic is about, and that letter helped put it in perspective. At the beginning of the war, the Minister of Transport of the Mackenzie King government wanted to encourage merchant sailors to step up and really be brave about their role of delivering the goods to Britain. And he referred to the merchant sailors as the fourth arm of the fighting force. After the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force was the Merchant Navy. And so they would be proud fourth members of that fourth fighting arm. Isn't it interesting that 6 years later, when the war was over and all the veterans returned to civilian life, the only ones who didn't get pensions and land grants and education, veteran status, were the merchant sailors. They didn't get it for 49 years. But at the beginning of the war, they're the fourth arm of the fighting force. The other side of the ocean is the opposition, essentially driving the convoys down, destroying them, and completely baffling the escorts, created by the U-Boot-Waffe. And the commander of the U-Boot-Waffe, the commander of the submarines in Germany, was Karl Dönitz. He had been in the First World War, captured in 1918, repatriated to Germany between the wars. He goes back to the submariners, and he completely changes the strategy of the U-boats in the beginning of the Second World War. Instead of lone wolf attacks, which is what they used in the First War, one U-boat going out and expending all of its torpedoes on a convoy, that spotting U-boat would simply shadow it, not fire a shot until others gathered, creating a larger number of U-boats to have greater impact on devastating the convoys. And this is a pack phenomenon that he describes as part of the strategy. Now, U-boats had a really interesting advantage if they were on the surface. Naturally, if they're deeper in the water, there's more resistance of the ocean, and they are slower. They couldn't keep up to the convoys if they were entirely submerged. On the surface, they're tremendously agile, maneuverable, fast, and here's an added kind of element that the U-boats had that the Allies didn't realize. The Allies had what was called ASDIC, which is a primitive form of sonar. Sonar sends out a sound wave into the water, hits a U-boat, comes back as a signal, and tells the Allies there's a U-boat down there. ASDIC didn't work on the surface. So that the U-boats are fast, maneuverable, and on the surface, invisible. And the final element of surprise, we're going to attack at night. And so the devastation that happens in the convoys for the first 2 or 3 years of the war is because of those tactics. He calls it Riddell tactic, wolf pack attack. In the second chapter of the book, called Death of a Convoy, I take you aboard one of the early convoys in September 1940. And I got the reports of, the reminiscences of 6 men who survived the sinking of a tanker in that convoy. It was called HX-72, Halifax 72, the 72nd convoy to leave Halifax. And you get a strong sense of what it was like to survive the devastation when a convoy that left with roughly 50 ships arrives with 30 on the other side of the ocean. And this was common because of the wolfpack attacks. I wanted to get to the core of what it was like to be a merchant sailor. How old do you think that guy is there in that picture? How old are you? You're 10 and 9. How old does he look? Maybe 12 or 13? Well, you're not far off. He's about 16. 17, yeah. Well, he joins the Merchant Navy at 16 or 17, and he writes his mom back home in Cornwall. She is waiting for his letters, and this guy wrote prolifically. And the only reason I got this stuff is that I met a woman in Brantford who said she had a Rubbermaid box in the basement that nobody wanted. It was full of the letters that John Burney Dougal had written to Rachel, his mother, throughout the war. And she said, "Are you interested?" I said, "Am I interested?" 100 letters came out of that Rubbermaid box. And he writes early on, when the war begins, about his route, by the way. He was with a British merchant ships. So he'd start in England. They would go across the equator to Venezuela, load up with bunker C fuel oil in Curaçao, then come up through the Caribbean along the eastern seaboard and meet the convoys leaving Halifax, escorted back to Britain. That was his circuit, okay? So he goes through Halifax and he writes in his letter to his mom, the censors in Halifax are as thick as flies. Well, the censor sees this because they opened all his mail before it goes to mom. And the censor says, to Rachel, you might want to tell your son to be a little less cheeky in his letters, or else they might not arrive. But he's persistent, and he talks about getting back to Britain at the end of his circuit, and how when he gets there, he goes and visits his Scottish relatives and senses from their lives what rationing is like. Again, I'm reminded, this is about keeping the UK alive. They're now without tin goods and tobacco, but he has that. Here's a Canadian who takes on that sort of stiff upper lip attitude in Britain that they had during the war when he says, we shall prevail. This is a young man with lots of spunk, lots of intelligence, and lots of drive, because he wants to improve himself. If you were in the Merchant Navy during the war, the Holy Grail was a certificate of merit, which meant that you had achieved, after testing and studying, a grade of importance to gain the quality of, or the stature of, an officer. And he gets that stature. In 1941, he becomes a third officer at about age 20 aboard SS Gretteval. And he is absolutely enthused, and he writes Rachel about how proud he is, and this is exactly what he wanted. And it all came to an end in 1941, because his convoy, SC, Slow Convoy 52, leaves North Sydney, and they're going up the coast of Labrador, and their convoy, like the one I just described a minute ago, runs into the largest wolf pack ever at that point of the war, and all the ships are told to scatter, run for your lives. Gretteval doesn't make it, and John Birney Dougal disappears, never to be seen or heard from again. But you see that little Rubbermaid box in the basement means that he didn't die. His stories survive because the family cared enough to preserve them, and I tripped over them and helped to restore his rightful place in this story. What did the Merchant Navy do? There were 12,000 of them from Canada in the Merchant Navy. Here's a fabulous statistic. They were, despite the decimation that I've been describing, they were able to accomplish 25,343 transatlantic trips throughout the war. What did I say the duration of the war was? 2,074 days, right? Well, they managed to deliver 90,000 tons of freight to Britain every one of those 2,074 days. And these were the men who, at the end of the war, weren't considered veterans for 49 years. We owe them a debt of gratitude. We can't even begin to thank them enough. 377 convoys left Halifax, 177 from North Sydney. If anybody been to Halifax and stood in the Citadel, and you look to the basin, the Bedford Basin, to the north, imagine that basin so full of ships you could walk across the basin. Hundreds of ships waiting to power through what they were facing in the North Atlantic and supply England with the survival goods. The losses, 2,233 ships were lost, and 1,300 Canadian merchant sailors lost. The sacrifice was dear indeed. Women joined the Royal Canadian Navy in 1942. Do you think you'd like to join the Navy, ladies? No. Well, you might end up looking as pretty as she does. Her name is Margaret Lose, and she was 18 when the war started. Imagine yourself doing that. You'd look pretty good in one of those HMCS caps, I think. Anyway, the government decides to allow women in the Royal Canadian Navy in 1942, creating the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service, aka the Wrens. And Margaret was kind of interested, but she was taking care of her mom, who was widowed and frail, and she thought, I better wait. But she suggests she might be interested, and her mother says, I got a bunch of wimps for daughters. And she says, Margaret says, but I thought you wanted me to stay home and take care of you. And her mom says, I want you to have a life. And so she takes the bull by the horns. She goes to HMCS York on the lake shore, still there today, and she joins the Wrens. And she becomes one of 7,000 Wrens doing really important service. For example, here's a clip. I'll just go through this because you can't. Is it there? Anyway, she talks about joining the Navy when the problem was when she faced. No, it's not there. When she recognized the problem of men leaving her community in Toronto all the men were going, and it was the women left behind. And she said it was really important because with the men gone, women got a chance to do the jobs that they'd been excluded from because of the absence of the men. And so she joins the Navy. She said she didn't know why, because Toronto, in her words, was not a Navy town. And so she went to train and ultimately ends up in HMCS Coverdale, which I'll show you an image of in a second. But she said one of the things that was attractive about the Navy was if you lived in Toronto, there were 5 women for every man at that point in the war. If you went to Halifax, there were 10 men for every woman. Not bad odds. Anyway, she joins HMCS Coverdale, and she becomes a Huff Duff operator, an operator on something called high-frequency radio detection finding. That's a highfalutin sounding phrase for a radio that was able to pick up transmissions of U-boats sending messages back to France, occupied France and Germany. In other words, we could triangulate on where those transmissions originated in the Atlantic, and then she would run out of her booth where she was listening, run down the hall, give the message to somebody who tapped it out on Morse code to Bletchley Park, which was the location in England where they were breaking the code of Enigma, and that information was then transposed or transported to the convoys to steer around where those transmissions were originating. Are you with me? So if we know where the U-boats were because of the transmissions, we can certainly steer the convoys around them. And she did that right through the war, right through till May of 1945. In fact, she, on her Huff Duff operational service, on her watch in April, she gets in clear German that Hitler's committed suicide, the reins of power have gone to Karl Donitz, and he then tells the U-boats to surrender the first week of May. And she's there, right through the war, playing that important role as a listener. The Corvette Navy comes along beginning in 1939-40. Here's some images of it. This clip talks about how Canada was desperate for ships. Of course we were. We only had 13, right? And so suddenly we're manufacturing these things on a model that was given to us by the British. It was a Corvette. And the Corvette was cheap, it was fast, it was efficient, and we had plenty of locations around Canada where they could be built. All around the Great Lakes, in Collingwood, and Midland, and Kingston, and along the eastern seaboard, and up into Quebec. All these ships were being manufactured suddenly to populate our Navy to go from 13 to 400 in 6 years. Now, why were these things so important? You'll see a little graphic here indicating the way they looked. They were originally whalers. They were used to chase and track down whales. But they were now equipped with a 4-inch gun on the front, and at the stern they had depth charges. These were big, huge drums of TNT, which when they dropped into the ocean were set hydrostatically to explode at specific depths. In other words, if you knew that the U-boat was at 50 feet below the surface, you could set the hydrostatic setting on the explosives to wait until they got to that depth, and then the hydrostatic response of the apparatus delivering the explosion at the appropriate depth. These ships were essentially brought into full production to these numbers early in 1939-40. They were called Flower-class corvettes because they were all named after flowers. And the first of them went to Britain. Then the next group were kept in Canada. And here's where their dimensions, what their dimensions were. They were 200 feet long, 33 feet wide, and I did some calculations. The square footage roughly inside a Corvette was about the size of the average Canadian bungalow. You know what a bungalow is? How many of you live in a house that maybe has 2 or 3 bedrooms at home? You do? Yeah, okay, might be a bungalow. So if it's a bungalow, it's got roughly 1,600 square feet in it. Now, it would have a power house of this kind of an engine. It would have that kind of armament. But here's the most important thing. Aboard a Corvette would be anywhere from 85 to 100 men. Now, think about your bungalow and stick 85 to 100 men in it for 2 to 3 weeks without showers. And you've got life on a Corvette. Churchill called them the cheap and nasties, because they were $530,000, which sounds like a lot of money, but it wasn't as expensive as, say, an aircraft carrier or a battleship or a cruiser or a destroyer. So these things were the workhorse of the Royal Canadian Navy, the Corvettes, okay? Now, one of the Corvette sailors, and I interviewed many of them over the last 40 or 50 years, was this man. His name is Gordon Baines, And his son gave me his father's correspondence. He left Montreal to go to Halifax to train to become a telegrapher, or telegraphist. Do you know what a telegraphist is? What's tele mean? Sort of vision, right? Only it would be audio. Have you ever heard of anybody who sits at a radio and goes, what's that? What's that called? Somebody help them. Morse code. And you would send a message. So every one of those little dits and dots would be a letter, and you'd send those to your reception on the other end. He would learn how to do that, and he would become a telegraphist. But he was also writing his mom and his girlfriend, Hazel Lacroix, back in Montreal. And here's a really interesting thing. We hear about the fragility, the vulnerability, the sensitivity of relationships during the war. You didn't want to befriend anybody in the military because tomorrow they might be gone, and you'd suffer loss every day. He recognizes that in the letters he writes to Hazel. Here's a sample. He said, prospects ahead are really uncertain. I came through the Depression. I don't know whether I'll survive the war, but bright eyes, he calls her. I love you dearly, and I want to make sure that we keep our relationship strong. And she writes back, because he's coming home for Christmas, Boy Blue, Christmas can't come soon enough. And you know what happens. He comes home. Isn't that a great picture? Look at the smile on that guy's face. You swallow the canary, right? Anyway, they get engaged and they survive. They survive the war. She is a Wren and he is a telegraphist aboard HMCS Amherst. Now, the first generation of corvettes were named after flowers. The second, third, fourth, fifth generations were named after towns and cities because the man in charge of building them, a minister in the King government named C.D. Howe, Minister of Supply and Services. He was also known as the Minister of Everything because he had his hands on the purse strings to build these things. Anyway, they begin to build these, and they're commissioned, and the Canadians, all the regular force officers and sailors are spread thin across the ranks of the corvettes every time they get new ones. And he becomes a leading telegraphist on Amherst. And he's a member of what was called the RCNVR. If you're going to go from 13 ships to 400, and you go from regular force of, say, 3,000 to 100,000, which is what we did during the war in the Navy, you've got to have a lot of volunteers. So you have the RCNVR, the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve. He was an RCNVR guy. They were known as the Wavy Navy. The Wavy Navy because if you were a regular force and you had rank on your sleeve, it would be a solid straight bar. If you were a volunteer, your rank would be like a wave on the ocean. Hence, the Wavy Navy. Is this up, do you think? Let's try. This is what life was like on the Wavy Navy.
When you thought of the Wavy Navy,
yeah, there it is.
You thought of the corvette. Somebody called it the child of urgency. It was built like a whaler, and it was small and cheap and seaworthy, and it could get around. The depth charge was a can of TNT, and it was our best defense against a Jerry U-boat. But there were times you didn't have to worry about U-boats. You didn't even give much of a damn for girls. The first real blow broke most of the crockery, but not many guys cared if they ever ate again anyway. Somebody said a corvette would roll on wet grass, and I believe it. The mess deck of a corvette was no place for a guy who couldn't stand crowds. It was also no place for a guy who liked food. The common dish was stewed tomatoes and undercooked bacon. For reasons of its flavor and appearance, it was generally known as red lead and bacon. The corvettes were sort of the cowboys of the convoys. You went back and forth through the lanes, keeping everybody in line and picking up stragglers.
Now look at that face. Is that the face of a character or what? What's he wearing on his eye? A monocle. He served in the First World War in the Royal Navy, and then, between the wars year, he went back to his ranch in BC. So he was known as the monocled cowboy. And his personality, being a bit of a character, I'll tell you, in one instance, he came up on deck. He was commander of HMCS Chambly, one of the corvettes, and named after the community of Chambly. Anyway, he comes up on deck wearing his monocle, and he stands up in front of his crew to inspect them, and they're all wearing monocles. without even thinking about it, he flicks his head back, the monocle goes up in the air, comes back down, lands exactly on his cheek where it was, and he says, when you all can do that, you can all wear monocles. This man was a brilliant tactician, as well as being a character. He takes the Corvette Navy, instead of being simply a bunch of sheepdogs, essentially reacting to the U-boats, he turns them into sub-killers. In other words, he changed the tactics from defensive to offensive. And I go into great detail in the book as how he does that. But the most important aspect was, he was working originally in Halifax, which is way down there in sleepy Nova Scotia. He gets to the Newfoundland Escort Force, which is 500 or 600 miles closer to the North Atlantic, where the war is. Now he takes his training men out into the Atlantic so that his Corvette crews are being trained on the job to become sub-killers. And he succeeds. They're among the first of the Corvettes to start sinking the U-boats in 1941. Anyway, great character, great guy. How many of you saw The Imitation Game? The movie about Bletchley Park. Hopefully this will work, Graydon. I'll kill my audio here and see if we can get the trailer.
If you speak a word of what I'm about to show you, you will be executed for high treason.
It's beautiful. It's the greatest encryption device in history, and the Germans use it for all communications.
Everyone thinks Enigma is unbreakable.
Let me try, and we'll know for sure.
Mr. Turing, do you know how many died because of it?
I don't.
3. While we've been having this conversation.
Gentlemen, meet Mr. Turing.
We are to work together then. I'm afraid these men would only slow me down.
Popular at school, were you?
We're short on staff.
We get more staff then. You have 6 minutes to complete the task.
Is that even possible?
No, it takes me 8. 5 minutes and 34 seconds.
You said to do it in under 6. What is it that we're really doing?
We're going to break an unbreakable Nazi code and win the war.
Oh.
Oh, she says. Oh, she says. Only she should have said it the way we say it in Canada. Oh. You know why? Because the woman who worked with Allan Turing at Bletchley Park was a Canadian, Nan Adair. I met her in 2006, and she told me how she became a member of the Bletchley Park encryptors and decoders. She had been born in Britain. She grew up in St. Catharines. She goes back to England, tries to get into the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, doesn't succeed. She's told to go down the road to Milton Keynes, to this mansion, where she goes for an interview. She walks in, and behind that desk is a man to interview her. Have you ever been to an interview? Someone's asking you questions. Imagine sitting there in that room getting these questions. He says to her, "We understand you'd like to join us. We're looking for the cream of great minds. We call ourselves the family." And Nan thinks, oh my God, what's a Canadian girl doing in a place like this? I've only got a high school education. He says, that's okay. We'll assess you. And she says, well, what am I expected to do? Well, you're going to have to work shifts night and day and sign the Official Secrets Act, which means you cannot whisper a word of anything you're doing to anybody. It has to be top secret. What's that mean? You can't tell anybody, right? Yeah, shh. Right. Okay. Anyway, he says, well, I can give you some time to think about it. She says, that's nice. And he says, you've got 5 minutes. She joins, and she becomes one of 10,000 people at Bletchley Park. By the way, the Germans had no idea Bletchley was there. They dropped one bomb on the place all through the war by accident. Nan is there, one of 10,000 people, mostly women, working on decoding on apparatus like you see there. It's called a bomb, B-O-M-B-E. And it essentially took all the probabilities of the codes, and which were a million possibles, and broke them down to fewer than 1 million so that the decryption people could then determine what was in the Enigma codes. She worked there throughout the war. I asked her about how it all worked, what she did, and she's, I'm still governed by the Official Secrets Act. Yeah. Here's one story she did tell me. On those long nights, can we have the lights back up, please? On those long nights in Britain, when all these absolutely brilliant minds, the cream of great minds, the mathematicians and the scientists, the philosophers, the historians, the psychologists, are all gathering to decode Enigma, they would have these great conversations in the lulls between the decodings. She was there, Nan was there, listening to all these great minds debate the war, debate politics. She said it was riveting, and she contributed a very important element. Every once in a while, someone in Canada, where she had lived a number of years in St. Catharines, would send her a package of powdered pure milk chocolate, which the British hadn't had in years. And so they boil up the kettle and serve hot chocolate around the room and stimulate the conversation. And she said when the conversation and the hot chocolate ran out, they all put their cups away. And Alan Turing, the greatest mathematician in Britain, took his cup, wiped it up, put a chain through it, and then latched it to a wall. He was afraid someone was going to steal it. Anyway, that's the kind of story she gave me. Color, background, personality of what was going on. Here are the statistics of the losses. This is important. 24 Royal Canadian Naval ships lost during the Battle of the Atlantic. Crews went anywhere from 100 to 200 men. 2,000 killed. Air Force, I haven't even touched on Air Force. The problem that Air Force faced was this. You got aircraft that come from North America, can only go so far, and then they can stay with the convoys to drive the U-boats under, and then they got to retreat to their bases, otherwise they'll fall into the ocean. The same from Iceland, the same from the UK. So there was this huge gap in the middle of the North Atlantic called the Black Pit. Anybody ever heard of the Bermuda Triangle? What's that? A place you don't want to go, right? Because ships sink mysteriously. Well, it wasn't a mystery in this place. The Black Pit was where the U-boats ran roughshod over the convoys. The objective of the Air Forces was to shrink the Black Gap, continue to give the air coverage of the convoys until the gap disappeared, or the pit disappeared, to give the convoys the security of getting across that gap to safety. In the course of that operation, for 2,074 days, we lost 752 Royal Canadian Air Force air crewmen. A heck of a huge loss, but nobody knows about it. I've mentioned the merchant ships that were lost and the merchant sailors. Here's a really interesting analysis of how often you might become a casualty if you were a Canadian in the services. If you were in the RCAF, the Air Force, there was a 1 in 16 chance you could be killed, wounded, or captured. If you were in the Army, a 1 in 32 chance of becoming a casualty. In the Royal Navy, Canadian Navy, 1 in 47 chance. In the Merchant Navy, 1 in 8 chance. Don't join the Merchant Navy, you can become a casualty. The men who didn't get veteran status until 1994. One last story, because everybody who's a historian has to give balance. This man on the left with his mother in 1939 is a German. He became a Canadian after the war, but his name is Walter Schmiedenknock, and he was an engineer aboard a U-boat. And I got his story on the internet, but I'll explain why that's important and how it plays into the equation. On the picture on the right shows them training. They were training in bathing suits and respirators to escape a sinking or sunken U-boat. Every day, they would go into a tube. Imagine that you here in this front row are all enclosed in a replica of a U-boat, which would be a training device. So it's a big tube that's sealed. You go into it and you sit on a bench. You're all side by side, all your crewmen. And you've got your respirator and your bathing suit, and you're sitting there, and the water flows into the tube until the air disappears. And then you put the respirator on. And then there's a hatch at the top of that tube. And it opens to reveal, it only opens when the water levels in this device and the one above it, which contains water as well, replicating the water from the top of the U-boat to the surface of the ocean. You got to get through that too. So you have to get from your bench, through the hatch, into the second tube of water to the top of it, replicating your surviving a sinking U-boat. That's what this guy was training every day at Wilhelmshaven. Frightening, he said, but the instructors told him he had to do it. Okay, so now he goes to sea in U-767, and it was a commissioned U-boat late in the war in 1944, and it had one of these devices, a snorkel. Now, I can't go into a whole lot of detail, but anybody who knows anything about submarines knows that they operate on battery power. And the battery power is charged up by diesel engines, but you can't run a diesel engine while you're submerged, suffocate the crew. This device allowed the U-boat to power up the batteries while on the surface and invisible, traveling, moving, charging the batteries, giving the U-boat speed and distance and long life under conditions at sea. U-767 goes all the way across the North Atlantic to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia on a mission to shoot at ships coming out of Halifax and North Sydney, and then suddenly D-Day happens. They rush back across the ocean to attempt to thwart the Allied landings in France. They sink a frigate, a Royal Navy's frigate. The Royal Navy pounces on them, U-767. They go to the bottom of the English Channel, so disabled that the U-boat is sunken and likely not to survive. And here's a reenactment, if we can get the audio on this, Graydon, to show you what happened in this moment. Are we there? Here we go.
Walter Schmietenknoop is an electrician on board the damaged U-boat.
We were around 18 men in the back. And then the water slowly creeps up. My comrades were dead already. You hear them screaming a little bit. All I knew, the water was here to my mouth. And I knew the air is too thin. And there's the torpedo hatch. And then I was waiting. It is ages, maybe just a few minutes. Then I saw the hatch lifts, grabbed the latch, and I went out there. So I put my oxygen hole into my mouth and start breathing through the tank. I was the only survivor.
The only man who survived the sinking of that U-boat. One final statistic to put into perspective what loss means on both sides. I talked about loss on the Canadian side, loss on the German side. The Kriegsmarine, the war navy in Germany, sent 40,900 German sailors aboard 830 U-boats. The Allies destroyed or sank 84% of them. That is, 25,870 German submariners died during the Second World War. The greatest service loss of the war. So they lost too. Loss was common in war. But the book, oh yeah, he was captured on the surface by the Royal Navy. He was sent to the United States to become a prisoner of war. He then moved to Canada, to a POW camp in Western Canada. He was repatriated to Germany, decides at the end of the war to emigrate to Canada, goes to BC, raises a family, and his 3 daughters gave me permission to use his memoir periodically through my book. You can't just take it off the internet and use it, right? The internet is free, but it's not for free, right? Right. A lesson learned at a very early age. It ain't free. In any case, they gave me permission to use his accounts of what that experience was like. Anyway, that's essentially my presentation, talking about the legacy of the war, but all of the things that we can recognize as artifacts, floating museums, and so on. But it's really people, the witnesses, who in all of my books, likewise in this, give you the story of the Battle of the Atlantic. Thank you.
Technology might fail us, but Ted Barris never will.
Turn. Shuffle this way. Right close, Mark. That's good. Thank you. Color party switch. Good morning. My name is Barris. We will start the celebration out here with the singing of God Save the King by the Southwold Public School.
God save our gracious King, long live our noble King. God save the King. God save our gracious King, long live our noble King. God save the King. Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King.
Welcome to our 23rd Remembrance Day service in Southwold. As Sarah has mentioned inside, weather permitting, and it looks like a beautiful day today, we will be honored with 2 flyovers during this service. We will pause at those points in our service to observe the missing man salute before resuming our presentations. I am assisted today by Reverend John Brown and Reverend Diane McPherson. I'm going to ask you to please pause and we'll bow our heads and pray. O Lord our God, in this place of memory we offer our words of prayer. Today we are acutely aware of the fact that our freedom did not come lightly. For so many people around the world fighting discrimination and oppression, they long for the freedom that is ours. For the veterans who have died, and those still a part of our communities, we pause to say to them, thank you, thank you. Help us to teach our children and grandchildren how much we are in debt to those who have defended and still presently serve, to the end that we may live in freedom. Help us to make Canada worthy of their dedication and sacrifice. God bless our church, and may God bless our country. Amen. Please bow your heads as we remember those members of our community who have fallen in service for their country, and to acknowledge the courage of those who still serve. assisting with the presentation of wreaths this morning are the St. Thomas Legion 41 Color Guard, number 7 Royal Canadian Army Cadet Corps, and 741 Elgin Royal Canadian Air Cadet Squadron.
All party, order! Colors! And up, hey!
With us today is Lynne McFarlane to present this wreath for the Silver Cross family for her great uncle, RCF Flight Sergeant Lloyd Douglas Bennett. She is joined today by her mother, Lloyd Bennett's niece, Doreen Bennett Francis. And it is interesting to note that Lloyd was born 105 years ago today, November 6, 1917.
Flight gets a little closer, we will all come to attention. I will give the word.
We are joined by representatives of government, veterans, and the community for the presentation of wreaths, memorializing our war dead. Representing the Government of Canada, Kathryn, Member of Parliament, Alden, Middlesex, London. Province of Ontario, Ted Ransom, representing Rob Flag, NPP, Elgin, Middlesex, London. For the County of Elgin, Grant Jones, representing Deputy Warden Tom Marks. For the municipality of Southwold, Sarah Emmons, representing Mayor Grant Jones. For the city of St. Thomas, Mayor Joe Preston. On behalf of the Canadian Armed Forces, Captain Lynne Riddell. On behalf of the Southwold veterans, Sherry Benedetti and Ronald Newland, in memory of their late father, Southwold veteran Francis Newland. On behalf of the Royal Canadian Air Force, Sergeant Lieutenant Rivard. On behalf of the Korean War veterans, Paul Roshan and Robert McGinn. On behalf of Number 4 Bombing and Gunnery School Association, Brenda Longhurst, in honor of her late father, Lawrence Tyson. On behalf of the 31st CER, the Elgins, Captain Andrew Havis and Warrant Officer Marco de Benedetto. On behalf of the St. Thomas Legion Branch 41, Wayne Donnelly. On behalf of the Native Veterans of Oneida, Will Alden. On behalf of the 4 through 7 Wing Air Force Association, Sergeant Riddell, Second Lieutenant. Representing the Ontario Provincial Police, Acting Staff Sergeant Isla Holmes. Representing Dutch Canadian families, Ida Martin. On behalf of Warren Lodge, 120, J. Brack. Representing the Southwold Youth, Georgia Kennington. On behalf of the Southwold History Committee, Aaron Pollard. Representing the Elgin Historical Society, Sarah Emmons. At this time, we invite the children in attendance to participate in this morning's service by placing a wooden cross at the memorial site. I ask that all children come forward and receive their crosses from our Silver Cross family representatives, Lynne McFarland and Doreen Francis, to my left here.
In honor of the Silver Cross family of Lloyd Douglas Bennett, this morning's lament is a sonnet penned by RCA pilot John Gillespie McGee Jr. shortly before his own death in a training accident in 1941. On flight. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds for her. I danced the skies and lapped the silver trees. Sunward I climbed and joined the tumbling earth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung, high in the sunlight silence, hovering there. I chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through fruitless falls there. Up, up, the long, delirious, burning blue. I topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even Eva flew. And while the silent lifting mind I trod, the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
I wish to share with you the benediction. O God, we remember those who are forever young in your presence. Guide us today, tomorrow, and in our future as we continue to work for peace in our generation. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with each of us. Amen.
In Flanders fields. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, beneath the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the lark still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch to yours who hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field.
We ask that everyone join with the Southwold Public School Choir now and stand up at table for the playing of our national anthem, O Canada. This concludes the 23rd Annual Southwold Remembrance Day service. Our Memorial Committee sincerely thanks everyone who participated in events this morning. Thank you, Ted Barris, for the presentation of the Battle of the Atlantic. Anyone interested in purchasing a personalized copy of Ted's book should join us immediately in the Keystone complex or contact the Southwold Township offices. We invite you back inside the Keystone complex for fellowship and refreshment. Please join us for Remembrance Day services next November 5th, 2023. Parade Marshal, march off.
Sir, other party and parade will march off. By the right. You okay?
The video of the Silver Cross will be playing in the hall if anyone's interested.
Parade, by the right. Quick, march.
Thank you, everyone. That was amazing, and we'll see you next year. We'll see you next year. First time hearing God Save the King. They had to learn it.
The village of Tobbitville is situated in Southwold Township at the intersection of highways number 3 and 4, two of the oldest roads in Elgin County. In 1917, it was a busy crossroad for travelers from all directions. Travelers taking highway number 4 south towards St. Thomas passed through the small Southwold community known as Sandymount. On the northeast side of number 4 highway, now known as Sunset Road and Major Line in Sandymount, Southwold, Frank Ernst Bennett and Sadie Hazel Ross Bennett began raising their young family. Lloyd Douglas Bennett was born November 6, 1917, the third child of Frank and Hazel Bennett. Brothers Lawrence and Ross preceded Lloyd. A younger sister, Marjorie, rounded out the Bennett household. As a young boy, Lloyd Bennett attended two local landmark institutions. The Tobbitville Methodist, later United Church, served his spiritual guidance, while Lloyd's early education commenced at Tobbitville Public School, SS number 6. By 1925, Lloyd's father Frank had moved his family to the city of St. Thomas. At a young age, Lloyd was already showing initiative to be a wage earner, securing part-time employment as a newspaper carrier with the St. Thomas Times-Journal. While individual names are not recorded, it is very likely Lloyd Bennett was with this group of Times-Journal paper carriers when they assembled at Pinafore Park in St. Thomas, Ontario in 1931. Lloyd completed his elementary school education attending Myrtle Street Public School. He earned his entrance in 1931 and then attended St. Thomas Collegiate Institute 1931 to 1937, earning his senior matriculation. Following his high school graduation, Lloyd was hired as a pharmacy apprentice at the Al M. Her Drug Store in St. Thomas. He worked at the store from 1937 to 1940. It was long enough for Lloyd to make an informed career choice. From 1940 to 1942, Lloyd was off to the University of Toronto to study pharmacy. Lloyd appears to have made an impression in his time at U of T. The 1942 school yearbook reveals a nickname, Ezra, acknowledges he dabbled in all sports and was news hawk of the class. The yearbook also touches on Lloyd's aspirations for the future, commenting that he hopes to operate a store where his rural touch will be appreciated. Although he was not a big man, standing only 5 feet 6 inches tall, Lloyd Bennett certainly pursued his love for all sports, as his list of sports participation while attending university illustrates. Lloyd also began training for another team when he enrolled in the Canadian Officer Training Corps while at U of T. It wasn't all sports with Lloyd Bennett. He successfully passed the licensing examination at the Ontario College of Pharmacy and obtained his Bachelor of Pharmacy from the University of Toronto. Following his graduation, Lloyd moved home to Aylmer, securing employment at L. H. Leggett and Company in Aylmer as a druggist and assistant manager. Lloyd Bennett left the pharmacy in 1942 to join the RCAF. He enlisted in Toronto on the 25th of August, 1942. The usual litany of questions had to be diligently asked and answered. Lloyd was accepted in the Royal Canadian Air Force. The next thing was to identify for which role he was best suited to serve his country. Lloyd signed up with the idea of becoming a pilot, but had discomfort on rides and swings. The Royal Canadian Air Force assigned him to flying duties. Lloyd entered the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, BCATP, on December 2, 1942. Over the next 14 months, Lloyd was to spend time in a number of Canadian provinces, as his training took him from Ontario to Manitoba, Alberta, Quebec, and finally to Nova Scotia. On December 10, 1943, Lloyd officially earned his trade as an air bomber. He was now Sergeant Lloyd Bennett. The air bomber's role was to relieve the navigator after the aircraft was in range of the target. He would take on the demanding task of visually pinpointing the target, guiding the pilot onto it, operating the bomb site, and dropping the bombs. To round out his duties during the long flight, he routinely manned the nose-mounted machine guns. Lloyd Bennett would be an integral member of an 8-man bomber crew. February 28th to March 5th, 1944, Lloyd Bennett completed his British Commonwealth Air Training Plan training at No. 1 Depot at Lachine, Quebec. Bennett embarked from Halifax, Nova Scotia on March 5, 1944. He disembarked in the United Kingdom on March 14, 1944, and was sent first to RAF Millen and then to RAF Hickson for training on heavy bombers. By September 10, 1944, he attained his rank as Flight Sergeant. On September 28, 1944, Flight Sergeant Lloyd Bennett joined 625 Squadron based at RAF Szturn. The squad was equipped with Avro Lancasters as part of No. 1 Group RAF in Bomber Command. The squadron mainly carried out night raids against Germany. On Saturday, October 14, 1944, Flight Sergeant Lloyd Bennett was scheduled to participate with 625 Squadron in Operation Duisburg. Duisburg was a major logistical center in the Ruhr area and a prime location of Germany's chemical, steel, and iron industries. It was a frequent target of the Royal Air Force. The regular crew of Lancaster LL-956 CFQ flew under the capable direction of Captain Pilot Officer Lloyd Albert Hanna. The crew had participated in 9 previous operations since their arrival at RAF Szturn on August 3, 1944. With the benefit of his experience in 9 previous operations, Pilot Officer Hanna was considered sufficiently battle-hardened to take on 5 rookie flyers for Operation Duisburg. Only the navigator and rear gunner from his regular crew would accompany Pilot Officer Hanna on the flight. The remaining crew, including the second pilot, would be on their first operational flight. Flight Sergeant Lloyd Bennett, the 27-year-old native of Talbotville, Ontario, would serve as bomb aimer. Lancaster LL-956 CFQ lifted off from the RAF Szturn runway at approximately 6:28 a.m. The Royal Air Force report details what happened next.
Aircraft LL-956 took off at dawn on the 14th of October, 1944, with a high-explosive bomb load and a weight of 65,000 pounds. When halfway down the runway, intermittent whitish flames were observed at the starboard inner exhausts. The aircraft appeared to take off and climb normally, and shortly after it left the ground, the exhaust flames seemed to disappear. The aircraft made a right-hand circuit, but when downwind of the airfield and approximately 2,000 feet in height, it dived steeply and exploded on impact with the ground. The accident must be attributed entirely to a technical failure of the starboard inner engine. The captain and crew appear to have taken correct action to deal with the emergency, F.S. Bennett bailed out, but his parachute failed to open, presumably due to his delay in pulling the ripcord.
Flight Sergeant Lloyd Douglas Bennett had participated in a World War II air operation for all of 6 minutes. He became the first casualty of LL-956. Pilot Officer Lloyd Hanna, a Canadian from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, skillfully maneuvered the stricken aircraft in the air long enough to avoid 2 English villages, Fatherby and Little Grimsby, thus averting a major civilian catastrophe in the English countryside. Captain Hanna perished in the crash, becoming the second casualty of the Lancaster LL-956. The remaining 6 personnel in the crew parachuted to safety. Word of Lloyd Bennett's passing reached his family a few days later. The community was informed in the Aylmer Express newspaper. Wing Commander W.A. Dix offered solace to Bennett's mother in a November letter on behalf of the Chief of Air Staff.
Dear Mrs. Bennett, it is a privilege to have the opportunity of sending you the operational wings and certificate in recognition of the gallant sacrifices rendered by your son, Flight Sergeant L.D. Bennett. I realize there is little which may be said or done to lessen your sorrow, but it is my hope that these wings, indicative of operations against the enemy, will be a treasured memento of a young life offered on the altar of freedom in defense of his home and country. Yours very sincerely, W.A. Dix, Wing Commander.
In an online feature on the fate of Lancaster LL-956, the website aircrewremembered.com speculated on why Flight Sergeant Lloyd Bennett perished in this disaster. It is difficult to explain the death of the air bomber Flight Sergeant Bennett. His position as a member of the crew would make him responsible for removing the forward escape hatch to facilitate the bailout for the forward 6 members of the crew. The rear entry door would be the escape route for the 2 gunners. Flight Sergeant Bennett should have been the first to leave through the nose hatch. If so, his parachute failed to deploy due to faulty packing or his inability to pull the ripcord. However, there is another explanation that is just as plausible. After releasing the hatch, he assisted the other members in their escape and then stuck his head into the cockpit just to the right of the pilot officer Hanna's feet and asked if he could help his pilot. It is noteworthy that they shared nationality, age, and Christian names. Fighting to control a mortally wounded bomber with his life unraveling before his eyes, it is quite likely that he exhorted, "Lloyd, go now!" We will never know, but by now the altitude for a safe bailout was lost in their slipstream. Flight Sergeant Lloyd Douglas Bennett was laid to rest at Harrogate Stonefall Cemetery, Yorkshire, United Kingdom. He is remembered locally in the Tobville Women's Institute Tweedsmuir book and the Central Algin Collegiate Book of Remembrance. Perhaps the most fitting remembrance of the crash of RAF Lancaster LL-956 and the fate of Flight Sergeant Lloyd Douglas Bennett is that the resulting crater from the crash has been preserved in its natural state since October 1944.